Every once in a while, we find heroes, born not of a single act, landing an airplane, running into a burning building, but those who commit themselves to an ideal, something far greater than themselves, and for all too brief a moment, they show us who we are and who we can be. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Yuri Gagarin, Alexei Leonov, Neil Armstrong, Nikola Tesla, Karl Marx, Mahatma Gandhi, Isaac Newton, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, and Winston Churchill, to name a few. The list may seem long, but indeed, lucky is the person who manages to live in the same generation as one of these heroes. Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was born January 5th, 1929, in Atlanta, Georgia, to Martin Luther King Sr., an African-American Baptist minister, and his wife, Alberta King. Dr. King had an older sister and a younger brother, and as children, all three of them were required to read and cite verses from the Bible. At the age of 5, he had already memorized and could recite a number of hymns and verses from memory. He also experienced violence at an early age at the hands of his father, who would regularly whip his children and, in fact, demanded that his children whip each other. Dr. King also had a violent temper and regularly got into fights with other boys in the neighborhood. He even once grabbed a telephone, struck his brother with it, knocking him out. He became friends with a young white boy whose father owned a neighborhood business. They were best friends until starting school in September of 1935, when King was forced to attend an all-black school while his friend attended an all-white school. King tried to remain friends with the boy after school, but the boy's father forbade it, telling King, quote, "We are white, and you are colored." This was King's first experience with segregation. His parents explained to him the dark history of the United States, the slavery, the bigotry, the racism, and King felt his anger swell. He decided upon a campaign of retribution and vengeance, and later described himself as, quote, "determined to hate every white person in America." His father, ever the minister and experienced in counseling African Americans in how to deal with their rage, told King that this was not Christian and that it was his Christian duty to love all people. King watched as his father would confront segregation and racism with dignity and integrity. Once, when buying shoes in downtown Atlanta, after being told that they had to sit in the back of the store, King's father replied to the owner, "We will either buy shoes sitting here, or we will not buy them at all." King had already begun learning a number of instruments, but he also began singing in the church choir. He became a bit of a celebrity for his rendition of his favorite hymn, "I Want to Be More Like Jesus." He was 10 years old when the movie Gone with the Wind was released in Atlanta. His choir, all black, was asked to sing for an all-white audience at the premiere. King agreed, but he went dressed as a slave. The next year, he learned that the parade would be in town. His parents couldn't take him, he couldn't go alone, and so he was forbidden to go. He went anyway, sneaking out of the house without telling anyone. While he was out, his grandmother had a heart attack. Upon hearing the news that she had died, King blamed himself, saying that God was punishing him for lying and for sneaking out. He ran down the hallway and jumped out of a second-story window. His father, once again a little more level-headed, said that it could not possibly be the young boy's fault. He explained that everything happens according to God's plan and that nothing can possibly change this plan. It was her time to die, and she would have died whether King had snuck out of the house or stayed at home. This shattered the young man's faith. It made no sense to him that God had already decided everything that was going to happen. This meant that prayers didn't matter, good works didn't matter, nothing mattered. Everything one could possibly do in one's life had no impact whatsoever. For all he knew, his grandmother may not even be in heaven. There may not even be a heaven. This crisis of faith in his Christian upbringing only grew as he watched what he called the racial humiliation of his friends, family, and of all black Americans at the hands of white Americans. This was not the work of a just God, and he stunned his minister and the church as a whole when he denied the resurrection of Jesus Christ. He told his father that he would attend church if he was forced to, but he told him not to ask that he speak passionately about God or the Bible. He could recite the verses, but he no longer believed them. His junior year, he entered an oratory contest and gave his first public speech ever, saying that Black America still wears chains and that the finest Negroes are at the mercy of the meanest white men. He won that contest, but found his victory hollow when, while riding the bus home, he and his teachers were instructed to stand to make room for white men who had come on board. Fed up with the racism and indignity, he simply said no. Enraged, the bus driver called him a black son of a bitch, and just as it appeared as if things were going to turn violent, one of King's teachers turned to him and pointed out that all of them were going to have to suffer the consequences for his rebellion. He relented, and he stood with all of his teachers for the remainder of the ride. Resentment continued to fester in this boy, already well known for his inability to control his temper. But everything changed for King when he moved to Connecticut to attend Morehouse College. There, he witnessed the single most incredible thing he had ever seen in his young life, a city that wasn't segregated. He wrote his father, telling him, quote, "After we passed Washington, there was no discrimination at all. The white people here are very nice. We go anywhere we want to and sit where we want to." He described restaurants, diners, theaters, buses, even churches, where he could sit anywhere he wanted and with anyone he wanted. It was at this time that the president of Morehouse College, Baptist minister Benjamin Mays, saw something special in his new student. King had professed an inner urge to serve humanity, but said he did not trust religion and never would. Mays began to mentor the young King, but he argued, its faults aside, religion would still be the best way for him to realize his goals. After years of consideration, King finally relented, but said that while he would make peace with the Baptist Church, he would not be like other ministers. He would be what he called a rational minister. His sermons would not be about God, but about a respectful force for ideas, even social protest. King vowed to return to the South, where his work was most needed, and preach social justice there. After graduating, King attended seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania. It was there that he met the love of his life. She was the daughter of a German immigrant who worked in the cafeteria. Her name was Betty Moitz, and she was white. The relationship grew, and soon he realized that this was the woman he wanted to spend the rest of his life with. All but his closest friends worked hard to discourage the relationship, arguing that it would make his future difficult, to say the least. And at a time when a Gallup poll had 94% of white Americans disapproving of racial marriage, it would make working in the South all but impossible. But in typical King fashion, the more he was told he couldn't do it, the more he entrenched and said that that was exactly what he was going to do. When she was interviewed years later about their relationship, she said that what she loved most about King was his enthusiasm, how he wanted to return to the South and to change things for the better. She said that even then he knew that he could be a force for change in the world. After 2 years of dating, they secretly became engaged. Finally, a friend took him aside and explained that if he wanted to marry her, that was fine, and he might, if he was lucky, be able to be a minister in one of the northern states. But he would never be able to go back to the South to be a minister. No Black Baptist church in the South would ever accept a minister with a white wife. King's mother had also become distraught over the news. She had already been deeply concerned that he had been willing to date women of other races, but when she learned that he had become engaged, she became utterly inconsolable. King would have to choose between his family and a life fighting injustice in the Deep South, or marrying the woman of his dreams. Dr. King broke the engagement. Later, his closest friends would recount that for the rest of his life, Dr. King never recovered from the loss. After graduating Morehouse College, King went to Boston University for his doctoral studies. He became a minister at Boston's 12th Baptist Church and would guest minister at other churches in the area, while also auditing philosophy classes at Harvard University. It was there that he met a young woman named Coretta Scott. She told him that she had no interest in preachers or in becoming a minister's wife, but he persisted, and they married on June 18th, 1953. 2 years later, he completed his doctorate in theology and returned to the South, as he had promised, to Montgomery, Alabama, and became a minister of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. It was at this point that he was elected to the executive committee of the Montgomery NAACP. On December 1st of that year, a young black woman, tired and just trying to get home, was told that she would have to give up her seat on the bus to a white passenger. She refused. Rosa Parks was now on her way to becoming the most famous person ever to ride that bus, and she was arrested and taken to jail. 4 days later, after a vacancy had opened up, King was elected the leader of the Montgomery Improvement Association and was tasked with organizing the Montgomery bus boycott. Aware that the city could not afford to even run the buses without the revenue from their black customers, the boycott organized alternatives for their black brothers and sisters, carpools, walking routes, so that nobody would have to take the bus. The loss of revenue ended up being devastating to the city's economy, rendering the boycott brutally effective. Roughly 2 months into this boycott, one in which nobody did anything, they just stopped taking the bus, a bomb exploded at Dr. King's home. Nobody was injured, but a crowd gathered and vowed to find the people responsible and pay them back for this assault on Dr. King. King convinced them to go home, but the bomber was never found. 11 months later, the civil rights movement got its first big win when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that segregation on any public bus anywhere in the country was illegal. And on December 21st, King became one of the first passengers to ride the newly integrated buses in Montgomery, Alabama. King then formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, an organization whose principal purpose was to fight segregation and achieve civil rights. He began attending and participating in large events like the Prayer Pilgrimage for Freedom and the Freedom Riders. This yielded even more victories, with Congress passing the first civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. Then, on September 20th, 1958, while signing books in the shoe section of Blumenstein's department store in Harlem, 𝐒𝐨𝐿𝐼 broke from the line and approached the minister, demanding to know if indeed he was Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. He nodded, and she pulled out a 7-inch letter opener and then plunged it into his chest all the way up to the hilt. She then turned around, left the store, and hailed a taxi. King was rushed to the hospital, but the prognosis was grim. Doctors indeed did manage to save him, but they had to remove 2 ribs and part of his breastplate. They later told him that the blade had been so close to his aorta that if he had so much as sneezed, it would have killed him. Recovering in the hospital, King received a number of letters from people, well-wishers from the U.S. and from around the world. He got 1 letter each from the president and vice president, and 1 from the governor of New York. But he later said that he honestly couldn't remember what any of them had said. Of all the letters he had gotten during his recovery, he remembered only 1. It was written by a girl in the 9th grade at White Plains High School. She wrote, "While it should not matter, I would like to mention that I am a white girl. I read in the paper of your misfortune and of your suffering, and I read that if you had sneezed, you would have died. I am simply writing to tell you, to say that I am so happy that you didn't sneeze." On January 20th, 1960, Martin Luther King Jr. moved to Atlanta and became a co-pastor with his father, Martin Luther King Sr., at Ebenezer Baptist Church. He began organizing even more events, including lunch counter sit-ins, student protests, and boycotts. In one such occasion, he walked into a restaurant for whites only and sat at the counter waiting to order. He was arrested, sitting there still asking for a menu. He was sentenced to 4 months in jail, but was released early when 2 brothers intervened on his behalf. Presidential candidate John F. Kennedy and his brother Robert Kennedy interceded and were able to get King released. Meanwhile, more civil rights laws were passed, including a ban on segregation in interstate transport. On April 12, 1963, Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was among nearly 50 protesters and civil rights leaders who were arrested after a Good Friday demonstration in Birmingham, Alabama. He was thrown into solitary confinement, denied his phone call, denied a lawyer, denied the ability to speak with his wife or with anyone on the outside. He had already instructed his followers not to bail him out so that his confinement might draw further attention to the plight of the civil rights movement. 8 local Christian and Jewish religious leaders then published an open letter criticizing King for his demonstrations and calling him an outside agitator who had no business in Birmingham, Alabama. From prison, without any notes, no access to books or a library, no research materials of any kind, he drafted a reply, quoting everyone from St. Augustine to Socrates, from Thomas Jefferson to Chief Justice of the United States Earl Warren. He castigated both the nation's religious leaders and more moderate white Americans for sitting passively on the sidelines while King and others risked their lives for change. "My dear fellow clergymen," he wrote, "while confined here in the Birmingham City Jail, I came across your recent statement calling my present activities unwise and untimely. Seldom do I pause to answer criticism of my work and ideas. If I sought to answer all the criticisms that cross my desk, my secretaries would have little time for anything other than such correspondence in the course of a day, and I would have no time for constructive work. But since I feel that you are men of genuine goodwill and that your criticisms are sincerely set forth, I want to try to answer your statements in what I hope will be patient and reasonable terms. I am in Birmingham because injustice is in Birmingham. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Never again can we afford to live with the narrow, provincial, outside agitator idea. Anyone who lives inside the United States can never be considered an outsider anywhere within its borders. You deplore the demonstrations taking place in Birmingham, but your statement, I'm sorry to say, fails to express a similar concern for the conditions that brought about these demonstrations. You may well ask, why direct action? Why sit-ins and marches and so forth? Isn't negotiation a better path? You are quite right in calling for negotiation. Indeed, this is the very purpose of direct action. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has consistently refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks to so dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored. My citing the creation of tension as part of the work of a nonviolent resistor may sound rather shocking, but I must confess that I am not afraid of the word tension. I have earnestly opposed violent tension, but there is a type of constructive nonviolent tension which is necessary for growth, to create a kind of tension in society that will help men rise from the dark depths of prejudice and racism to the majestic heights of understanding and brotherhood. We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Frankly, I have yet to engage in a direct campaign that was well-timed in the view of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation. For years now, I have heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. We must come to see, with one of our distinguished jurists, that justice too long delayed is justice denied. We have waited for more than 340 years for our constitutional and God-given rights. The nations of Asia and Africa are moving with jet-like speed towards gaining political independence, but we still creep at a horse and buggy pace towards gaining a cup of coffee at the lunch counter. Perhaps it is easy for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say, wait. But when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will, and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, and even kill your black brothers and sisters, when you see the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the middle of an affluent society, when you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she cannot go to the public amusement park that has just been advertised on television, and see tears well up in her eyes when she is told that Funtown is closed to colored children, and see the ominous clouds of inferiority beginning to form in her little mental sky, and see her beginning to distort her personality by developing an unconscious bitterness towards white people. There comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over, and men are no longer willing to be plunged into the abyss of despair. In no sense do I advocate evading or defying the law, as would the rabid segregationist. That would lead to anarchy. One who breaks an unjust law must do so openly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the penalty. I submit that an individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice is in reality expressing the highest respect for law. Of course, there is nothing new about this kind of civil disobedience. Academic freedom is a reality today because Socrates practiced civil disobedience. In our own nation, the Boston Tea Party represented a massive act of civil disobedience. We should never forget that everything that Adolf Hitler did in Germany was legal, and that everything the Hungarian freedom fighters did in Hungary was illegal. It was illegal to aid and comfort a Jew in Hitler's Germany. Even so, I am sure that, had I lived in Germany at the time, I would have aided and comforted my Jewish brothers. If today I lived in a communist country where certain principles dear to the Christian faith are suppressed, I would openly advocate disobeying that country's anti-religious laws. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's greatest stumbling block in his stride towards freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers the absence of tension to the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goals you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes that he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythological concept of time and who consistently advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill. I felt we would be supported by the white church. I felt that the white ministers, priests, and rabbis of the South would be amongst our strongest allies. Instead, some have been outright opponents, refusing to understand the freedom movement and misrepresenting its leaders. All too many others have been more cautious than courageous and have remained silent behind the anesthetizing security of stained glass windows. This letter would later come to be known as the Letter from a Birmingham Jail and became one of America's greatest pieces of writing. It was published by the Atlantic Monthly and the Christian Century, though the New York Times refused to publish it. 4 days after the letter was published, Robert Kennedy once again intervened, this time as Attorney General. King was released, but he was told never to come back to Birmingham. 2 weeks later, in a press conference in Atlanta, Georgia, King announced that he would be returning to Birmingham. As he boarded a plane for Alabama, 2 plainclothes officers, David Orange and Dan Johnson, boarded the plane with him. King was also traveling with Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, who, as it happened, knew both the officers. Upon recognizing them, he brought the Reverend over and said, "Dr. King, I want to introduce you to the men who are going to arrest you when we arrive in Birmingham." While in Montgomery, Dr. King joined thousands of school children to take part in what would later be called the Children's Crusade, marching through the streets advocating for racial equality. Birmingham's Commissioner of Public Safety, Eugene Bull Connor, ordered that fire hoses and police dogs be turned on the young protesters and jailed more than 600 of them on the first day alone. These tactics were broadcast on national television and around the world, horrifying Americans and humiliating Birmingham. The town asked to negotiate with the protesters, and 2 days later, the Birmingham Agreement was announced, desegregating all stores, schools, and restaurants. All of the charges against the protesters were dropped. The next day, a bomb ripped through Martin Luther King Jr.'s hotel. The bomber was never found. 1 month later, President Kennedy announced new civil rights legislation and became the first U.S. president to say publicly that segregation is illegal and morally wrong. The Detroit Freedom Walk came 1 month after that, and in the wake of violent attacks against civil rights demonstrators in Birmingham, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference joined with the NAACP and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters to make 3 separate planned protests into one. This would be the March on Washington, to call for fair treatment and equal opportunity for Black Americans, as well as to advocate for the passage of the Civil Rights Act, which had been stalled in Congress. John F. Kennedy then held a secret meeting with civil rights leaders, asking them not to do the march. He argued that it was ill-timed and that the goal was to get Congress to pass the bill, not to just have a big show at the Capitol. Dr. King told the president, "Frankly, I've never engaged in any direct action movement which did not seem ill-timed." Reluctantly, Kennedy agreed to endorse the march, but he had his brother Robert coordinate with organizers to ensure security. He also got civil rights leaders to agree to end the march at the Lincoln Memorial instead of the Capitol, so as to not make members of Congress feel like they were under siege. On August 28, 1963, 250,000 people gathered at the Lincoln Memorial. Of the many presenters that day, King was asked to speak, but at the end, and he was given only 5 minutes. He ended up speaking for 16 and gave what would become the most famous speech of the civil rights movement and one of the most famous speeches in history.
So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day Even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day, down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning, "My country, tears of thee. Sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. And so let freedom ring. From the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, let freedom ring. From the mighty mountains of New York, let freedom ring. From the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania, let freedom ring. From the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado, let freedom ring. From the curvaceous slopes of California. And when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, "Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last."
After this speech, the civil rights movement won even more victories, including the integration of all schools in the United States. Famously, Governor George Wallace refused to integrate the University of Alabama, but was forced to when President Kennedy sent the U.S. National Guard to enforce the law. 2 weeks later, a bomb ripped through the 16th Street Baptist Church, killing 4 black girls. Martin Luther King Jr. was asked to deliver the eulogy, which he did on September 22, 1963. September 22, 1963, the day John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Violence continued to escalate, and in an incident which would later become the topic of the movie Mississippi Burning, 3 civil rights workers in Georgia went missing and were later found dead. But there were victories, too. King attended the signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, where Lyndon B. Johnson gave him one of the signing pens. King was also named Time Magazine Man of the Year and became the youngest person ever to win the Nobel Peace Prize. The next year also saw the passing of the Voting Rights Act. King continued to protest and continued to be arrested at least 29 times total during the course of the civil rights movement. In one incident, 2 officers came to arrest him at his home, but before the officers could get him outside, a mob had formed and demanded that they release him. The situation escalated and very nearly got out of hand, but for Dr. King calming the crowd and saying that it was important that he go to jail, that he had broken the law and he would not resist. One of the officers later recounted that had King not intervened on his behalf that day, he doubted either men could have gotten out of there alive. In 1967, moved by the injustice of the Vietnam War, Martin Luther King Jr. formally included opposition to the war into his campaign and delivered his first anti-war speech on April 4th at New York's Riverside Church, literally in the shadow of the UN. 2 days later, he attended the largest peace protest in history, while the Justice Department comes out with a report that says that 50% of all eligible black voters in Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, and South Carolina are all registered to vote. In 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. announces a march on Washington to demand an economic Bill of Rights to guarantee employment to all able-bodied Americans and insurance to those who can't work. He is invited to Memphis to speak on behalf of striking sanitation workers, but his plane is delayed because of a bomb threat. When he arrives, he is forced to confront the increasing number of attempts on his life. And for the first time ever, he acknowledged the very real possibility that he would not survive this campaign. On April 3rd, he addressed it openly and in public in what would become one of his most famous speeches ever, known as the Mountaintop Address.
Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
He gave that address April 3rd, 1968. The next night, presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy went on television to address the nation.
I have some very sad news for all of you, and I think sad news for all of our fellow citizens and people who love peace all over the world. And that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis. Martin Luther King dedicated his life to love and to justice between fellow human beings. He died in the cause of that effort. In this difficult day, in this difficult time for the United States, it's perhaps well to ask what kind of a nation we are and what direction we want to move in. For those of you who are black, considering the evidence evidently is that there were white people who were responsible, you can be filled with bitterness and with hatred and a desire for revenge. We can move in that direction as a country, in greater polarization, black people amongst blacks and white amongst whites, filled with hatred toward one another. Or we can make an effort, as Martin Luther King did, to understand and to comprehend and replace that violence, that stain of bloodshed that is spread across our land, with an effort to understand compassion and love. For those of you who are black and are tempted to be filled with hatred and mistrust of the injustice of such an act, against all white people. I would only say that I can also feel in my own heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed.
2 months later, Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated while leaving the ballroom of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights leaders were in his hotel room when they decided to step out onto the balcony for some fresh air. A sniper, later identified as James Earl Ray, fired a single shot, hitting King in the head and killing him. The assassination sparked riots in dozens of cities. In D.C. alone, as many as 20,000 rioters overwhelmed the district's 100-member police force. The National Guard and 10,000 federal troops were deployed to try to stop it. Machine gun nests were deployed on the Capitol building, and the 3rd Infantry had to be deployed to protect the White House when rioters got within 2 blocks of it. This was the largest occupation of an American city since the Civil War. Across the country, thousands were injured. In D.C. alone, 1,200 buildings were destroyed, 200 in Chicago, and nearly 6,000 in Baltimore, where they had to deploy 5,000 paratroopers, combat engineers, and artillerymen from the 18th Airborne in Fort Bragg. President Johnson called for calm on both sides, feverishly calling civil rights leaders and asking them to halt the protests, while calling local politicians and asking them to make sure that the police did not retaliate. "I'm not getting through," Johnson said. "They're all holing up like generals in a dugout waiting to watch a war." He declared April 7th a national day of mourning for Dr. King, and at his funeral they played his Drum Major sermon, in which he said that at his funeral he would not want anyone to mention his awards or honors, but rather let it be said that he tried to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, and love and serve humanity. The Civil Rights Act of 1968 was passed on April 11th, just 7 days after King was killed. The autopsy of Dr. King revealed that while he was only 39 years old, his heart, worn by the stress of the civil rights movement, more resembled the heart of a 60-year-old man. In 2019, there was an annual reading of Letter from a Birmingham Jail on the floor of the U.S. Senate. That reading was led by U.S. Senator Doug Jones. Doug Jones is the senator from Alabama. Martin Luther King Jr. Day became a holiday, April 3rd, 1983.